Good to see all of you in the house of the Lord. And some of you may be thinking, Joshua got an easy passage to read. And there is partiality, perhaps even nepotism in the church. But it's just that the passage I'm working from happens to be that passage, and it was his turn. The lot was on him to do the reading. And I want to tell you a story. Last Sunday, there was a lady who came to me and asked me, what did Nishari do to you? And I'm like, expand on that, let me know. And she said, well, why did you give Nishari such a complicated passage to read? And I said, well, that was the passage, but Nishari, you did very well. You did very well considering all those difficult names. And that lady who asked me the question last Sunday might be wondering, now the son gets an easier passage to read. But you will see as we move through the book of Deuteronomy that there are some passages that are long, some passages that are complicated, and some are easy and short. Now, as you know, we are walking through the book of Deuteronomy. We are working on select passages that we will focus on, and I do want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I do want to thank the young adults. And Naomi, thank you very much for putting that service together. Is this loud enough? Can you hear me at the back? You can. Good. Well, you can, but how about the folk at the back? You can. Very good. So, that's better now. I think they upped it a little bit. So thank you for that very special service that, Naomi, you put together, especially the testimonies, hearing what the church meant to the young people. And that is always encouraging, because the young people are the future of the church. Now, we are coming from First Church. I had to preach there. We did a baby dedication. And there again, they have a very fine tradition where they have the young people come and read scripture every day. Young people, Sunday school children do that, and I did tell them that that is another fine tradition that they hold on to, because it means that you are investing in the next generation of leaders and planting the word of God. Now, we probably will be wondering, what's that passage got to do with our series on Deuteronomy? Now, if you remember what Joshua read today, it is a passage where Moses is looking back and explaining something to the people. I did tell you that I will be walking through the book of Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy essentially is 3 sermons. The first is chapter 1 to 4, and in chapter 1 to 4, Moses is looking back, and he is reminding the people of all that has been taking place. Then in the second sermon, he will talk about covenant stipulations, standards that are expected of them in the present. And then in the final sermon, he will talk about the future, what is expected of them as they enter and settle down in the promised land. Now, if you listen to the reading today, and if you paid attention, you would notice that this is in the section where Moses is looking back and reminding the people of what happened. And this passage is a painful passage. I wonder if you caught that drift. Because Moses says, because of you, I could not enter the promised land. Now, those are 3 words, because of you. Now, I should have started off by saying I'm going to preach on 3 important words. And some of you, because last weekend was Valentine's weekend, some of you may have got the wrong signal and said to yourself, I think I know what those 3 important words are. But if you went in that direction, then I'm sorry to break your heart. It's not those 3 words that people say during Valentine's weekend. These 3 words are because of you. What Moses is saying here is that because of you people, I was deprived of the opportunity to enter the promised land. Now, if you think this was just one instance where Moses is just sharing how he felt, we are wrong on that. Because in chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, between those 4 chapters, not once, not twice, But on 3 occasions, Moses will use that same 3-word phrase. Once in chapter 1, once in chapter 3, and once in chapter 4. He says, because of you, because of what you people did to me, I could not enter the promised land. In fact, in one passage in chapter 3 and chapter 4, he says, I talked to the Lord about this, and I pleaded with the Lord, and I said, may I go into the promised land? And the Lord said, no, you are not going. And the Lord said, let's not talk about this anymore. We don't want to talk about this anymore. Now, we have parents here. We have young kids here. And there are times when the children keep saying, I want this, and I want to do this. And you get to a point where you tell them, what? I don't want to talk about this anymore because the decision has been made. And that's the tone in which God is speaking to Moses and saying, Moses, I gave you my decision. You are not going to the promised land, and let's not talk about it anymore. So we ask a few questions as we begin. Why did God not allow Moses to go into the promised land? After all, this was Moses who sacrificed a great deal. Don't forget, he was raised in the palaces of Egypt amidst all that excitement and luxury and all of that. He sacrificed all of that, lived with the people, led them through many a hardship, and now he cannot go into the promised land. That's so unfair, God. And another question we may ask is, if he did so much, why is God saying, don't even talk to me about it? Another question that we may ask is, why is Moses, a giant in the faith, a man we respect and look up to, a man who led the people of God through many signs and wonders and miracles, why is he shifting the blame? Why is he telling the people it's because of you? And so to answer some of these questions, I want to take you back to the actual incident that caused Moses to be told by God, you are not going into the promised land. The incident is found in Numbers chapter 20. We won't go there today, so don't you worry and don't give Naomi that hard look. We don't have it for you today, but I'll tell you the story, and as good Fairview Church of God people, you know the story. In Numbers chapter 20, there is a water crisis. And the people of Israel, 600,000 strong, they have been complaining right through the journey. God did so many things. There were signs, wonders, miracles, but they took those things as granted. And anytime there was a little complaint, anytime there was a little shortcoming, didn't they make a big noise? And they grumbled, they murmured, and they said, we want to go back to Egypt. And at some points, they even took stones to kill Moses. Stone throwing in those days was not a hobby or not a favorite pastime. It is like saying somebody pulled a knife on me, or somebody had a gun and they threatened to shoot me. So Moses went through all of that. It's been a hard task for him. And then in Numbers 20, the people come and they complain to Moses and they say, we wish we would be back in Egypt. And something happens to Moses in Numbers chapter 20, and he snaps and he tells the people, you rebels, must we bring water for you from the rock? God gave him instructions in Numbers chapter 20, and he says, Moses, you have to speak to the rock in Numbers chapter 20. And God said, just speak to the rock and the water will come forth. But Moses, all these events converging on him, the complaints of the people, and if you read Numbers chapter 20 verse 1, you will discover that Miriam had just passed away. He's grieving, he's mourning over his sister's death. And on the other side, the people are complaining, 600,000 strong, saying, we don't have water. Why did you bring us here? It was too much for Moses. And God says, speak to the rock. And what Moses does is he loses it and he doesn't speak to the rock. He strikes the rock. Not once, but he wanted to make sure it was a good strike, so he gave 2 strikes. And that's what caused God to respond in the manner in which he did. And if you also look at Moses' response, or the word that he gave the people, he said, "You rebels, must we bring water out for you?" If you look at that statement, you will see there is no reference to God. There is no mention of the Lord doing the miracle. He calls them rebels. Now, when somebody calls you a rebel, is that a compliment or is that something that's not a compliment? It's certainly not a compliment. If you call somebody a rebel, you don't mean well. You're saying you're troublemakers. And here is Moses. God said, "Speak to the rock." And he decides to strike the rock and for good measure speak to the people. And what does he say? He calls them, "You rebels." Now there is another passage where God tells Moses to strike the rock. And that is in Exodus chapter 17. And there again, the people are complaining, the people are murmuring, and Moses follows God's instructions, and all ends well. But here Moses acts very rashly. He gives way to his anger, and then he says things he shouldn't have said. And God said, "Moses, you dishonored me before the people, because I was the one who provided the water. I am the miracle worker. I am the way maker. I am the one who used you. But you said nothing about me, and you chose to insult the people." And he said, "For that, you will not enter the promised land." Now, as you look at this incident or this narrative, there are 2 ways in which we can look at it. And let me outline the 2 ways. The first is you can look at it from a Moses-centered perspective. A Moses-centered perspective is, here is Moses, born, and then of course moved to the palace of Egypt, gave up much to come and lead the people of God, sacrificed a great deal, suffered with the people, took all their insults, their murmuring, and all their negative comments, their criticism, and finally God says you can't go into the promised land. And so if you take the Moses-centered approach, you will be thinking like, for all the hard work that he has done, he was treated unfairly. If you take the Moses-centered worldview, you might be thinking, this is so unfair. He put so much into the lives of the people. He did so much for them, and look how they respond, and look how God responds. And God says, you're not going into the promised land. And if you hold on to that worldview, you will recognize that even in our lives today, we run the risk of getting hurt. Because if we take the Moses-centered view when we work with people, when we work with communities, when we work with people outside, even in our workplaces, we say we do so much for them. We sacrifice a great deal for them. We go out of our way to do things for them. And then finally, when they turn their back on us, we become very hurt. We are like, that's not so fair. And that's the Moses-centered approach. The second worldview that we can possibly hold on to is we take the God-centered approach. The God-centered approach is, yes, it was Moses who was used by God to bring the people out of slavery, but it was God who enabled Moses. It was God who protected Moses. You remember when he was cast into the river Nile, it was God who watched over him. It was God who arranged for him to be transferred to the palace of Egypt and to be raised there. It was God who commissioned him. It was God who enabled him and gave him all the skills he required. And it was God who granted him the privilege and the responsibility to commune with God in a personal way. You know, there is a verse in the Bible that says that God had a very special relationship with Moses. We don't know how exactly they talked and communicated, but it was very deep, it was very special, it was very unique. And to this man, whom this great privilege was extended by God, God was expecting greater responsibility because the stakes were now high. And isn't that true even in our lives? When you serve in any organization or any institution, when you're lower down in the ranks, you can say anything and get away with it. But as you climb the ranks, as you become and enter into more and more leadership roles, when you hold a significant position in the organization, every word you say is measured against the ethos of the organization. Because any statement you make, any act you involve yourselves in is a reflection not only of yourself, but of the entire organization. So that's really where God is coming from. Moses, I empowered you. I commissioned you for this task. I used you to perform signs, wonders, and miracles. I used you to part the Red Sea. And it was me working through you. But because I've given you all these privileges, I now expect a greater level and standard of responsibility. Some of us may remember that Bible verse, and if you remember, you can finish it for me. Unto whom much is given, little is expected. No, Dennis is like, no. Unto whom much is given, that's exciting that even 10 minutes into the sermon, you are still awake. Unto whom much is given, much is expected. And that was God's perspective on this. Moses, I've given you much, and so I did not expect you to respond in such a fashion. And if you take the God-centered perspective and apply it to our lives, we recognize that we are what we are. All that we have achieved is because God has enabled us. We have families, we have blessings, we've achieved things on this earth, we are reaching out to people, we have the favor of God, but it is not because of anything that we have done. It is because God has enabled us. By ourselves, we are so unworthy. And the God-centered approach to what was happening in this passage sits well with the rest of Scripture. You remember King David, when God made that covenant, what did King David say? Who am I and who is my family that you should do this for us? He felt very unworthy. Just like I just talked about the God-enabled or the God-centered approach. You also see this in the life of the Apostle Paul. In 1 Timothy, when he refers to himself, he calls himself the chief of sinners. Now, I don't carry a pastor's business card. I don't know if Pastor Roger does, but I haven't seen one as yet. But imagine if I had a business card that said Pastor Ben, chief of sinners, and gave that out wherever I went. That would be quite a card, isn't it? That would be quite a story. But that's what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy. He says, I'm the least of the saints. I'm the chief of sinners. And that's because in his heart, he felt so unworthy. And he knew that all that he was achieving is because God was enabling him. And so if we take the Moses-centered approach to this narrative, in the passage that we read from Deuteronomy, we run the risk of getting hurt. We run the risk of feeling left behind. We run the risk of feeling bitter and carrying grudges against people because we believe we've done so much for them. And look how they have treated us. But if you hold on to the worldview that is God-centered and apply to this narrative in Deuteronomy, you will recognize that, yes, people let me down, people act differently, but I am doing it because God has enabled me. This is not about me. This was never about me. It's always been about God. And that's what Moses missed out in this little narrative here. In his anger, he said, you rebels, must we referring to himself and Aaron and all the other leaders, must we bring water out for you, saying that we are the ones who are doing it. And so that's something that I want to leave with you as we get into this passage. The second thought that I want to leave with you is Moses saying in this chapter, in this section that we read, because of you. And what Moses is doing is he's blaming the people. He's been carrying this hurt for almost 5 years. Scholars believe that if we go by a conservative estimate, that after what happened in Numbers chapter 20 and what you see here in Deuteronomy, there may have been a 5-year gap. Some put it as 15 to 20 years, but I'd like to go with a conservative estimate, which is 5 years. 5 years later, Moses is telling the people, because of you. He's still remembering the pain. He's still remembering the hurt that they caused. But they didn't cause the pain. It was his reaction to what happened. He lost it, he snapped, and as a result of that, he lost that privilege of going into the promised land. Some of you have heard me quote Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychotherapist. He was a Holocaust survivor. His family didn't make it during the Holocaust. They were killed. And he went on to develop what counselors use today, a technique called logotherapy. And he made a statement which I will try to share with you. And it is found in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he says that when we encounter the various challenges of life, that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And he says in that space, there is the choice that each one of us can make as to how we will respond. And in our response, we will find freedom and growth or defeat. And if you think about this narrative in light of Viktor Frankl's quote, you will see that there was the stimulus or stimuli. Moses had his sister's death to deal with. He had the people complaining, and all these converged upon him, and then he decided to respond with anger. Now, we've all been angry at some point in our lives, haven't we? The way you're looking at me, I get the feeling that I'm the only one who's been angry at some point in my life. We've all been angry at some point. It's about the little things, it's about the great things, it's about things that really irritate us. And that's because all these things stimulate us and we respond with anger. But remember, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And within that space, we can decide how we are going to respond. So as we look at this 3-word phrase, because of you, as we look ahead, we recognize that as God continues to lead and work with us, we will face challenges just like Moses did. We will face difficult encounters just like Moses did. But we have a choice to make, and we can decide how we are going to respond. 5 years later, you will see that Moses is still carrying this hurt, this pain, which is why you and I read about it. So this Sunday, we are in the season of Lent, and it is a season of reflection. It is also a month of the anniversary where we look back, which we've done. We've looked back and counted all the blessings that God has bestowed upon us. But as we enter into a new season, the season of Lent, as we enter into a new year, we're still in the early parts of 2026. It's a good opportunity to look back and ask ourselves, are we carrying any baggage that we should have left behind? Are we carrying anything that is not worth coming with us into the new season? I've told this story once 2 years ago, and I believe that most of you may have forgotten, but I'll try it again. This is about 2 religious monks, and they served in a very remote part of the country, and their religious order instilled in them that they should not under any circumstances touch ladies. No contact whatsoever. No handshaking, no hugging, none of it. And so they were part of a very strict order. And they faithfully served the community. I think I've now got your attention when I talked about this very strict rule. Everybody's looking at me like, which order is this? It's a little story, so don't try to Google and find out which religious order doesn't allow this and all that. But they served the community very faithfully. They helped people. And one day there was a flood. The riverbanks overflowed, and there was a flood, and lots of people were being swept away. And suddenly these two monks, as they were busying themselves helping people, they heard a loud scream, and there was a young girl who was being swept by the floods. And one monk, who was a good swimmer, I don't know where he learned to swim, but he was a good swimmer, he jumped in. He rescued the girl, he brought her back to the shore, and the village was extremely happy and grateful. And so they continued to serve the community. 2 years later, the two monks were having a conversation, and the other monk said, 2 years ago, you came in contact, you touched that girl when you rescued her. And I've been thinking about this. Our order prevents us or make sure that we come into no contact with ladies. How come you did it? And the other monk said, it is true that 2 years ago I rescued this lady and I brought her to safety. But he said, what grieves me is that for 2 years you have been carrying this girl in your mind, and that's what grieves me. And some of you got the story. Some of you are wondering, where did that story go? But the point we want to make is that sometimes we carry things in our minds that should not be there. We need to leave those behind. But sadly, Moses carried it, and he said all the time, because of you, because of you. And so as we look to the future, may God help us to leave what should not be part of our baggage, and may God help us to move forward with victory as we seek to serve Him. This is one of the things that encourage me, that the Bible is not written merely by men to prop God up. When they talk about our great heroes of the faith, like Moses and David, they present them warts and all. They talk about Moses carrying this hurt for a long period of time. They talk about the failings of David, the failings of Abraham. Now, if the Bible was purely a man-made construct, and if they wanted to prop things up to support God, they would leave things out like this. They would present Moses, they would present all the heroes of our faith in pure light, like they were perfect. And so when I read episodes and narratives like this in the Bible, I realize there is hope for us. There are times we fail God. There are times we get angry. There are times we do things we shouldn't have done. But there is always the grace of God and the forgiveness of God. And we come and we have the pleasure and the privilege and that grace to start all over again. So may God bless us as we continue to walk with Him in this new season.